Okay, well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to our first data salon. We plan on holding these panels monthly. Angie Raymond of Indiana University and I put this together to explore the potential use of data trusts in the United States. The idea is to give data subjects more control over how their data is used, while at the same time making anonymized data available for social good. So Angie, as you probably all know, is the director of the program on data management and information governance at the Ostrom workshop and an associate professor in the Department of Business Law and Ethics in the Kelley School of Business. I teach at the University of North Texas, and my research area is data privacy, United States and European, artificial intelligence, US, EU, and China, tech law and policy, and 5G technology. So in our audience today, we have people from Europe, the US, the UK, and Canada, and everybody's coming from jurisdictions with differing legal systems, which all provide differing levels of privacy protections. And I became interested in this idea of data trust when I was trying to discover a normative proposal to go with the problem of this mass collection of athletes' biometric data. Basically, professional sports teams are collecting so much data on athletes, but there is really very little control that the athletes have over this data. Its use is being contractually divided between the league and the device makers, and that presents a lot of risks for these athletes that are so-called voluntarily giving up this data. But really the thing that was interesting is this is a treasure trove of data, which researchers and medical professionals would love to be able to analyze. But that's really not the reason they're collecting it. So Angie had suggested this idea. She said, why don't you look into data trusts? And she referred me to Eleanor Ostrom's work governing the commons. And once I started looking into that, I thought, wow, this kind of fits. So for those of you who are not as familiar, Eleanor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize for her work about governance structures. And the idea was, and I'm obviously oversimplifying this, but the idea was that when you have a commons, such as a body of water, what happens is organically the people that use that commons come up with their own rules for how it's used and allocated. And what has been done is with this concept, it has been expanded to the idea of using it for data, especially data coming from smart cities, where you have all these differing interests and risks and concerns without really adequate legal protection. So I think people are becoming more aware of this idea of data trusts, but it definitely has the most robust understanding from my research in the UK. And that is why our first panel, I think, is so important. We have several scholars that are very involved in developing this concept and making it known. We have Sylvie Delacroix. She joined Birmingham Law School as a professorial research fellow who came from the University College London, where she was a reader in legal theory and ethics with a fractional appointment in UCL Computer Science. She's also the founding director of the UCL Center for Ethics and Law and a fellow of the Alan Turing Institute and Mozilla. Our second panelist, Jess Montgomery, is the executive director of the Accelerate Program for Scientific Discovery at the University of Cambridge, which is a new initiative developing artificial intelligence tools and collaborations to tackle scientific challenges. Her interest in AI and its consequences for science and society stem from her policy career, in which she worked with parliamentarians, leading researchers, and civil society organizations to bring scientific evidence to bear on major policy issues. Neil Lawrence is a DeepMind professor of machine learning at the University of Cambridge in the Department of Computer Science and Technology, where he also leads the Accelerate program for scientific discovery. He has a senior fellow AI fellowship at the Alan Turing Institute. So some of you may have noticed we provided a paper with this first session called Bottom-Up Data Trust, Disturbing the One-Size-Fits-All Approach to Data Governance, which is authored by Sylvia and Neil. And just to give you just a brief, very brief explanation for those of you who may not have had an opportunity to look at it, they explain that the concept of data ownership is insufficient as an answer to the problem of the widespread collection, use, and sharing of data. And in reading this, I realized how especially true this is in the US, because we do not have the level of privacy protections that they do, for instance, in the UK, Canada, or the European Union. They argue that a top-down regulatory scheme does not work because the legal and practical issues that the data use creates are so complex and multifaceted. So this collection and use of data is very risky to the data subjects from whom it's collected. And what they do is they explain this data trust as being able to provide some protection to the data subjects while kind of addressing this power imbalance. So when our data is collected, especially in the US, very few of us have any control over what happens to it after it's collected. And the idea is that these data trusts can serve as kind of a foundation for collecting everybody's input into how it should be done, but also being governed by a trustee or board of trustees. So I want to give each of our panelists the opportunity to discuss their experiences with data trust and how they became interested in this subject. And we'll go ahead and start with Sylvie, then Jess, then Neil. And as we go through the various topics, I will suggest that if you don't have anything to add to your previous speaker, just go ahead and pass it on to the next person. So Sylvie, do you want to talk a little bit about your background and your interest in data trusts?
Okay, well, background is coffee in the coffee shop. No, I mean, I should be serious. Well, it did come from a fairly random chats with Neil in a coffee shop. And I come at this from a perspective of, I'm a philosopher and a lawyer, and I work at the intersection between ethics and law. And I'm interested in philosophy that has an impact on the real world. And clearly, I think we need a lot more engagement from both lawyers and philosophers when it comes to data governance. And I do passionately believe that we need to be more creative about the kinds of solutions that are out there when it comes to addressing the gross power imbalance between us data subjects and them data collectors. And so I think it's interesting that there hasn't been that much talk yet of bottom-up empowerment mechanism as a complement to top-down regulation. And I hope that we can change that. And when I talk of bottom-up empowerment mechanism, I, of course, don't assume that data trusts are the only empowerment mechanism. Yeah, it's one tool among others. And it's really trying to address three problems, in my view. There's one, the idea that today, the consent is just not good enough. We can do better. Yeah. So when when our data is collected, it makes us vulnerable, as you were saying. And how do we address this vulnerability? Well, I don't think it's okay to try to do that via consent. We can do better, and data trust can do better. So that's the first thing. The second thing is empowering groups. Yeah. So much of the structure for the moment is very much geared towards individuals. But when you talk about data, it doesn't make sense to only focus on individuals. So that's the second dimension. And third dimension is really to say, let's stop separating conversations between the goods that can be achieved by sharing data on one hand, and the goods that can be achieved by protecting us from the vulnerability that we encounter when we go online and our data is collected. So these are the three key points that I would say I would flag as motivational for me. It's doing better than consent, empowering groups, and joining up conversations between data sharing on one hand and protecting us from vulnerabilities on the other hand.
Thank you. Jess?
Thanks. So unfortunately, given circumstances, Sylvie and I have never actually managed to have coffee in person in Cambridge, but I'm sure it's coming soon. And there were other coffees that have led to this collaboration. But my background is in policy, and data governance and AI have been really hot topics in policy circles for at least the last 5 years. And we already have a lot of legislation and a lot of frameworks that set out this forest of data rights and responsibilities. But we've known for some time that exercising those rights is difficult. It takes time, it takes resources, it takes know-how, and that's out of reach for a lot of people. So the challenge really now is to create structures that can bridge from our desire to share data into our concerns about how we protect those individual rights and how we hold people accountable for their responsibilities. Now, despite all the excitement there's been in policy circles about data trusts, well, for at least the last 2 years, there hasn't been an awful lot of movement in terms of making them really work in practice. And this is where I think some of Ostrom's work comes in that it offers design principles for us to begin to shift the conversation from theory to practice. So where Ostrom talks about needing clear definitions, we can think about what are we really talking about holding in trust? Who has different rights and responsibilities over different types of data? Where Ostrom talks about needing mechanisms for conflict resolution. Well, okay, what are the institutional safeguards we need to have in place to hold data trustees to account for what they're doing and for resolving tensions between parties with different interests? Then when Ostrom's talking about the need for adapting management systems to local conditions, well, how do we make data trusts that really represent the wide variety of different interests that are out there? So with that in mind, Neil, Sylvie and I have been working on a new project called the Data Trust Initiative, which is about really trying to make this shift from theory to practice, to learn from the work that's been out there on issues like collective governance, and to figure out what interventions can begin to shift the dial on the conversations we're having about data trusts and where they go next.
Thank you. Neil?
Thanks, Kimberly. I guess my journey with this was one of those moments where you sort of think, well, why shouldn't the world should work more like this? Why doesn't it work like that? And then I seem to have got a bit in too deep with that idea. So my background is as a sort of an algorithmicist in some sense would be a way of describing it. Someone who was working on machine learning methods. But I've always been very aware of the importance data has in those algorithms. And I actually became concerned about what the accumulative power that was occurring as a result of large amounts of data appearing in the same place was going to have in what I would call where we are now, which is, I wrote an article called Beware the Digital Oligarchies, in response to early work that was sort of talking about singularities in AI. And I genuinely think that that's what we have at the moment, a digital oligarchy. And I was having friends with a lawyer conversations. I was having friends with a lawyer conversation. I was having conversations with a lawyer friend. And we started talking about UK trust law as a potential mechanism for creating entities where people could deposit their data in a way that would allow the power that comes with accumulated data to be sat within an institution. And I suppose my journey after that is, after those sort of amateurish conversations, managing to bump into incredibly clever and sensible people who actually knew what they were doing over coffee, and getting some of these ideas written up in a much more formal way. So I actually mentioned some of these ideas in an early AI report in the UK, and unfortunately they didn't follow up on what those ideas meant. So that while those ideas entered that report, they didn't enter it in the form that they were intended. So a lot of the work since then has been trying to get people back aligned with this agenda, which is very much, I don't need to add much to what Sylvie and Jess said, to build these data institutions that basically realign the sort of power with the interests of the users, to ensure that we have power brokers who are operating on the level of negotiating with Google, negotiating with Facebook, who are, by the structure of the institution, and exactly as Jess was just saying, I think this is where Eleanor Ostrom's work comes in so importantly, and that's really what we need to address now, to ensure that voice is being properly represented at the top level. And I think we've just seen an extraordinary example with it in this terrible situation that we've seen with Timnit Hebrew and Google. And, to be honest, I think that was just an accident waiting to happen. I know most of the people involved, I respect many of them, but it's just a result of very large institutions who, whatever they believe their intent or their public voices are, their incentives are not aligned with the incentives of their users. And it's not enough to employ occasional, really hardworking, wonderfully good thinking people, because it just results in enormous tensions within the institutions. And I don't know the details, but which have exploded onto the scene, throwing a lot of egg on Google's face. And I think it'll have enormous repercussions and enormous stress for everyone involved, and a lot of lack of faith in the current digital oligarchy. So we're enormously lucky again that amongst those people, we also have Vilas on the call, who's funded the Data Trusts Initiative, which is, I think, where we really need to get, as Jess was saying, get serious with what the design of these institutions look like, and particularly that issue around within a local circumstance. And that's going to be local jurisdictionally, but also local contextually in terms of what the purpose of the data is. And actually, I'm really curious, and there may be experts in the call, that it's not just going to be these institutions, it's going to be ecosystems of these institutions that we're going to require to be representing us correctly within this environment. And I'm so excited and thankful for Kimberly and Angie for pulling this together, because it just really feels like this group is the next group of people we should be talking to in order to. We've got the policy, we've got the legal, we also now need the institutional awareness and the economic to make these institutions sustainable and reflect the values that we really want.
Can I just add a quick word here? So, because I forgot to flag this up. So I'm really excited to have this workshop right now for many reasons, but one of them is I am sure that among all of you on this call, many are interested in various forms of data governance structures. And I know that the word data trust is used to refer to a variety of things. So I'm very keen to hear what you're interested in, how you understand what you're working on, and how it differs in your from your perspective. In our world, there's data co-ops, data trusts, data commons, contractual structures. And I know that this doesn't always translate smoothly to the US. So this is really a great opportunity from my perspective to try and see what's lost in translation from one country to the other potentially. So please intervene and tell us, where you come from and how you see the complementarity between different structures. That would be very helpful.
Okay, one thing I think would be helpful for the audience is, and you touched on this briefly, but can you explain the bottom-up model, what you anticipate that looking like?
Okay, I don't want to talk too long, so I'm going to give you like a 2-minute summary, right? I'll try. So the idea is, with the data trust as we understand it, it's a legal structure based on trust law, okay, that enables people, groups of people, to place the rights they have over their data in trust. Okay, what does this mean? Now, of course, you need to have rights over the data. In Europe, it's kind of easy, there's GDPR. In the US, you might have contractual rights. You might have IP rights, though the question is whether it should be placed in trust, but that's another question. So you place the rights you have over your data into a trust. Then what happens is a data trustee is appointed to exercise those rights on your behalf. And the whole excitement comes from the fact that as soon as you have numbers of people doing that, you have a data trustee who's capable of leveraging accumulated data rights to potentially either negotiate better terms and conditions with various service providers. Think of Amazon, Facebook, etc. You could have a data trust sign-in, that sets your terms and conditions, or basically oversee data sharing agreements with third parties. So things that many of us would like to share our data for the greater good, but we don't, or I don't feel at the moment very confident that my data will be used always for the right purposes and in the right way. So you could have a data trustee who's tasked to oversee those data sharing agreements. That's the quick and easy summary. But the key word here is that data trust is meant to be used to refer to a legal structure that relies on trust law. It's different in that respect from data co-ops, which are also a way of a structure of collective empowerment, but they don't rely on trust law. Typically, they rely on either contractual or corporate structures. Okay, and basically, the key advantage of trust law is that it comes with built-in institutional safeguards that cannot really be easily matched in a contractual or corporate environment. So that's it.
Okay, one of the things that I'm curious about is when you have a trustee or board of trustees, how do the data subjects get represented? Is there communication between data subjects and the trustees, or are the trustees just acting in a fiduciary capacity and making decisions on their behalf?
So that's, I think, where the sort of institution, the particular institution will have its own constitutional terms, which is, I think, again, where Eleanor's model, really shines through. That we don't want to stipulate that. You can imagine certain things you would like to be represented, but those considerations, if they're overly stipulated, that gets back to the one-size-fits-all problem that we're trying to avoid with top-down regulation. So in some sense, I sometimes think of the data trust proposal as we lay it out and as we support as a mechanism for creating governances rather than governance in itself, which again, I think you can see ties in quite well with Eleanor's work. And I think there's a really key point here that I think is becoming increasingly important when we talk about this, that I think the thing Sylvie said about institutional safeguards, because there's other stuff, I think there's other concepts here where people need to have some sense of trust with small t in the entity that's being created. So you need to take advantage of existing regulation around what these institutions look like, such that they can believe that these institutions are empowered. And certainly within the UK, there's the courts of chancery, where some, which have some regulatory authority on trusts. And as Sylvie said, I think we're very curious to learn what people feel about that in the United States, where it'll be different, and perhaps, and a really big problem in the US is antitrust legislation. So the use of the term trust to refer to what we would say is a monopoly in the UK. So, that's kind of probably problematic with some of the terminology when it's trying to be explained to sort of general public or non-legal experts.
To build on that point, we know there is no single public view on what constitutes good data governance or an acceptable use of data. Individuals and communities have different views and different preferences. So what we need are mechanisms for people to express those views and to collectively come to a decision about what constitutes an acceptable use of data. We also know from previous public dialogues that the questions people tend to ask are things like, who is using my data, for what purpose, for whose benefit? And so we can expect that data trusts will be trying to grapple with these questions when they set in place those collective decision-making mechanisms.
What level of transparency do you see with the use of data trusts? I mean, from my perspective, it seems that it would open it up. What is your perspective on that?
Sorry, what transparency? So what kind of transparency do you have in mind? So transparency about the terms that govern the data sharing, or
the use of the data? So how?
Yeah. So here the idea is that at the moment we all are basically navigating in the dark, right? I mean, I have no idea of how my data is used, and if I tried, I would be spending all day with not much success. So there's the element of intermediary layer between us and data collectors, let's call them like that, which is missing at the moment from the data landscape. Yeah. So the idea being that just like we need doctors and lawyers, I mean, in my view, we need a new profession, and these are the data trustees. And the data trustees are effectively acting as a much needed intermediary layer that will be looking out for us about and trying to be very clear about how data is used, for what purposes, and reversing the direction of consent, ideally, so that it's actually your data trust that sets the terms according to which your data can be used. And then it's better than transparency. It's actually empowerment.
And I think it's such a, well, because transparency could occur at so many levels. There's the transparency of the governance. There's the transparency of decision making. Actually, I can't remember, am I pronouncing her name correctly? Jill Lepore's book, These Truths, which is a massive tome on the entire democratic history of the United States that I'm reading at the moment. And one of the things that she talks about there is early voting, how it was totally transparent and anyone could come and see it. And then all these bizarre effects that I can't even remember the complications because they're all intertwined with Jim Crow laws and the oppression of the Black vote in the South, that actually when they made it secret, it didn't have the effect that they wanted. So again, while transparency seems to be a good thing, there's so many local factors that I wouldn't want to be too prescriptive about it. But I would have thought, you know, I think one has to look at what are some of the key things you need. And within UK law around the trust, you have the trustee, you have the settler, and you have the beneficiary. And I think that there would be certain ways that you could construct your trust, which would be just about hiding what you're doing with data. And we know this because there are monetary trusts that are being used to avoid tax and are based in the Cayman Islands or whatever else, or avoid ownership. Within the UK, soccer clubs are often owned through these structures where it can be very difficult to tell who owns the thing, or they have been in the past. And we want to avoid that. So there's some sort of clear stipulations you would want around those. And I think the one that sticks in my head the most is that you would want the settlers and the beneficiaries to be an overlapping group. But even that one isn't a hard and fast rule, because you can imagine cases where you're settling data for the beneficiaries being your family members or something of that form. But if the settlers and the beneficiaries aren't overlapping, just to be clear, in UK trust law, the settlers are the people that are bringing the asset to be held in the trust, which is typically, or we would view it as the rights to the data. And the beneficiaries are the ones that the data trustees are managing that asset to the benefit of. So very often it's an odd thing to think, well, the settlers and the beneficiaries being the same group, because why do you need the trust then? Why do you hand over the material there? Well, here, of course, it's because the power with data only comes when it aggregates. So it's only once a group of people have settled their data together that the benefits can be truly taken out. And so but you still want that fiduciary responsibility because of the vulnerabilities of the settlers, because you're sharing rights to your data. Which, I mean, it's really interesting trying to sort of read back to that constitutional conference, you know, Madison, Jefferson, all these people, what they're trying to say about the freedom of individuals in those days, and of course, with extraordinary and horrific compromises in their document, and how that pans to our virtual selves. You know, in this very different era where freedom isn't just about physical freedom, it's about what world is presented to us and how we're constrained in the decisions and choices that are available to us through the way that the corporate world perhaps at the moment perceives us via our data.
One of the things that you touch on in your paper that I kind of wanted to get a little more information on is, will these trusts actually fund themselves? And if so, are you collecting money from people that the data is shared with? And are there dividends then paid to the beneficiaries? How does it work structurally from a financial perspective?
That's a great question, Kimberly. Thanks for asking that, because there's often, well, basically it can give rise to confusion because people sometimes assume that you have to choose, that you can either have privately funded trust or publicly funded trust. And I see no reason why you should have to choose. That just like we have privately funded medicine and publicly funded medicine, you may want publicly funded data trust and privately funded data trust. And in a way, the justification for publicly funded data trust would be very similar to justification that underlies the now compulsory subscription to a pension fund, right? The idea being that people don't understand very well the long-term risks associated with not subscribing to a pension fund. Same with data trust. And so you'd say, well, we need to give a choice. People need to be able to actually change and to shift from one data trust to another as and when their aspirations change or their needs change. And so then come the more interesting and difficult questions as to how different data trusts then interact with each other. Yeah. So what happens if in the Cambridgeshire data trusts, yeah, that share my education, social care, and medical data, and perhaps can I join another trust as well, a privately funded trust, or not? Yeah. So would there be a hierarchy between trusts with a meta trust that can then talk to little trusts, which are then perhaps lifestyle service providers, you know, who may be saying to me, Sylvie, in exchange for a fee of, I don't know, maybe let's make it very cheap, 25 pounds a year, I will make your life so much easier because you won't have to click away those do you consent every 2 minutes. You will have your terms set up by the data trust. So we're taking the headache out of data for you. So that'll be the lifestyle service. But then you would have meta trust, like the Cambridgeshire data trust or a medical data trust that says, hey, we are trying to gather as much medical data as possible. And we realize we need to do that in an intelligent and ethical way. So instead of talking to each and every individual, which is actually not that respectful even for the individuals, because often we're not very well placed to give consent as and when the data is needed, right? Say when I enter hospital, it's probably not the best time for me to think about whether my data should be shared or not. Whereas if the medical data trust is talking to my data trustee, then my data trustee can negotiate on my behalf potentially. So this gives rise to all sorts of interesting scenarios, right? About the jigsaw puzzle. How do different data trusts of different levels fit together? But of course, we're jumping ahead here because we don't have yet, as far as I know, a live data trust. And that's why I'd love to hear from you guys, actually, because please correct me if I'm wrong.
And just to quickly highlight that, of course, that's one of Eleanor's principles, polycentric governance. And it's absolutely critical in this case.
Did you want to ask the audience some questions at this point, or? Well,
there is a question in the audience I've seen, but sorry, I don't know. I see initials JWB. I don't know, Kimberly, if that's.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let's see. Let me get the chat up here.
That's me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, John.
I first want to thank the authors and proposers. I'm nearly giddy that y'all have opened up a research stream that I plan on writing for some time. I come from a business organizations and finance law background. I also did a lot of antitrust. And so I see just a giant host of cool issues that I believe will translate to most of the members of the old British Commonwealth, but particularly here in North America, where many things are of great interest in your proposal. But to cut to a couple of them quickly, it does seem like the trustee will have expertise and will be negotiating contracts, and wow, way cool if that can be automated contracting. But the trustee will have to be compensated. We'll have to, if there's competition among lots of trusts, then it seems like there'll be competition for good trustees. And so you need a funding mechanism. And wow, the notion that Washington, or I'm in Pennsylvania right now, Harrisburg would agree to pay for all this. I'm so sorry, it's just never going to happen in the US. So it really puts these trusts in the private sector, which is much of what trust law is in the United States anyway. Of course, we don't worry about antitrust anymore because that was a difficulty imposed by illiberal corporation law of the 19th century in the United States. Once Jersey and now, of course, Delaware made for liberal corporation law. It was no longer a need to hold lots of subsidiaries in a trust so that you could coordinate their action and act like a monopolist. Today, we worry about monopolists, and trusts barely come into play at all. Instead, I think you also have this difficulty in both international border crossings about understanding and disciplinary silo crossings about understanding, because, you know, my time at the IST at Penn State, trust was bandied about by information scientists, computer scientists, of course, as a psychological confidence kind of term. And for those of us who is a trustee currently right now and who studied antitrust and business organizations, we understand that trust is something else. So, you know, you're going to have to always try to overcome this baggage that comes along with the term trust. It's clear to me that you want the term trust to mean what I think a trust is all about, which is an expert with strong fiduciary duties doing some work for you, and you as the beneficiary will benefit from this, and that's marvelous. So again, I have 2 pages. You know, you've got me motivated. I'm going to write a little essay and send it to y'all so you can see what I see as a number of layers of issues, none insurmountable, or else I wouldn't be all that interested in doing this, because I like to do surmountable stuff. But I do think that you need to figure out your funding model or business model. Can't get away from that, because these things are going to be costly. They're going to compete. That was very clear from even the shortest of your summaries of this concept, and that is that, you know, some trusts will be open for people who love to have their data spewed all over the place, and others will be more closed for people like me who are privacy zealots. And there's a few other privacy zealots around in our big data group, so yeah, there'll be plenty of us who would love to opine about that stuff. So there's going to be competition. You know, how do things change over time as people move from one side of the privacy zealotry scale to the other side? You know, our California law closest to your GDPR, it might be the place to think about going first. And remember that data is fugacious. It wants to be free, and you're going to have that trouble no matter what happens. I'm winding down.
Thank you, John.
John, sorry, you have a slight disadvantage because you've sneakily used JWBs as your initials, so I can't quickly Google your background. Just say, which is my normal trick in these things, so I can pretend.
Bagby.
Oh, it's out. Oh, no.
So could you just say who you? I've understood some of your expertise, but your full name and what your current position is, because yeah.
My current position is at an Airbnb where my first grandson
what's your name and what's your expertise?
I'm a smart ass, and so why is it not clear? I'm 4 years retired from the Pennsylvania State University, earned my way up through full tenure prof at the Smeal College of Business, and then went to the Information Science School in 2001.
Okay, what's your name as well? Because I don't even know I know you're John, WBS.
So look on SSRN. Bagby, B as in boy, yep. A as in apple, G as in girl, B again, Y.
Bagby, right, brilliant, thank you. Because it's just not here, I have no way of telling, right? Thanks, John. I think that was exactly right. You actually touched on many of the things we've talked about in terms of how to deal with this. In the case where you've got a group where they're very privacy aware, it's quite likely that they might pay a subscription to be in such a trust. And there's no problem, as you're aware as a trustee, with trustees being paid for their work. They have to have an undivided loyalty, but they can be recompensed for going about their work. So you could imagine a subscription model to a trust that was, and I think there's really interesting questions around how do you actually get to a position where people want to subscribe? And you can imagine certain organizations or brandings launching a data trust. So within the UK, I'm always trying to bring this up with people who I think might be suitable. So for example, there's one bank, whose name I forget for the moment, there's a long established bank, very trusted by their customers. And you sort of think, well, have you ever thought that you could launch a data trust and have it, you wouldn't own the data trust, but you could tell your customers, join this data trust and it's going to be managed according to these terms. And I mean, nowadays banks aren't trusted enough to generally do this, but this particular bank is, it's owned by HSBC. Or you could even imagine newspapers. So you could imagine the New York Times sort of appealing to their particular authors saying, there's a New York Times data trust that we have decided to set up as part of our journalistic campaigning to solve things in this area. And then there would be a subscription thing. And of course, it would be run as a separate trust. The other one, as you pointed out, there may be some people who are happy to have their data shared and to be paid for their data being shared. And if you have such a situation there, you can also imagine that there's some percentage of the money that is there for the advertising is going to the management of the trust. But very, very importantly, as you sort of said, they're going to be in competition. So there's another facet that sort of becomes interesting about these trusts, which is perhaps different from normal trusts, is you need exit terms. You need the ability for someone, when they change their idea about how they want their life to be run, or when there's a scandal involving their data trustees not being competent or some organizational problems, that they can choose to leave that data trust and transfer the data rights they're holding to another data trust. Another thought that occurred while you were speaking, which I think is probably important to emphasize, it doesn't necessarily have to be the case. In fact, my guess is it's going to be generally not the case that the data trust itself holds the data. They would hold the rights to the data. The reason being is that you want this sort of separation between, my analogy is it's like the pilot and the plane engines. Early early flights, the pilot had to fix the engine. You don't really want a situation where your pilot is fixing the engine on the technical side. The data trustees, they will need technical expertise, as you outlined. They will need legal expertise. They're going to need to be highly trained. I also sometimes wonder, will they have these careers where they're sort of moving between being a data trustee, but then moving into companies that are negotiating with data trusts? So sometimes they'll be private, sometimes they'd be public, right? So it's a sort of lucrative career where they could move around like a sort of prosecutor does in the States. But you do want this sort of separation, that it's not necessarily, the data trust is not providing the technical infrastructure on which this is sitting. Just as Rolls-Royce manage the engines for these different airlines and the airlines manage their pilots and their destination. But I should let Jess and Sylvie come in.
We do have a couple of questions from the audience.
I saw Amanda's question.
Yeah,
just
Amanda, I would like to get to Amanda's question if we could. Amanda, do you want to put your speaker on and so you can explain what you're asking? Or
hi, everybody. It's really nice to be here, and also very nice to see Sylvia and Neil, who 2 years ago presented this paper at a workshop in Montreal, and now it's so great to see it published and see that you're still doing such important work on this subject. So thank you. So my question is really thinking about the role of data trust for public sector data governance. My background is in public administration, and I'm focused on how governments are grappling with some of the questions around how to use data and collect data in a way that retains confidence of citizens and that adheres to principles of good governance around things like equity, procedural fairness. So I think governments are really struggling to find mechanisms to do that, and I'm curious if data trust could be an instrument for them. At the same time, I'm not sure when I read about data trust that usually doesn't seem to be the example. So I'll read my question. Basically, outside their role as potential funders of data trusts, how do you envision the relationship between governments and data trusts? So could a trust serve as the intermediary between data subjects, in this case, citizens or residents, for example, of a city, and governments? And in that case, the trust would determine things like what data government could collect and how they could use it. And then the second question is, how would that fit into existing administrative and democratic structures that currently regulate how the state can collect data and apply those data and say decisions about benefits eligibility, for example, to be concrete?
I think Jess should have first intervention on this.
Thanks, Sylvie. So to kick off there, I think the EU's recent Draft Data Governance Act is interesting in this respect. That act is fundamentally about setting a regulatory framework for what the EU calls data intermediaries, which covers a range of different data sharing platforms, and providing structures to ensure that those intermediaries operate effectively. Now, squarely within the scope of that act and the supporting documents is public sector data and the use of public sector data to achieve some of the different types of benefits that we're talking about in terms of improving services or advancing research. But what that act is doing is saying that the EU sees a role there for itself, for government, in setting the regulatory framework and ensuring that there are those institutional safeguards in place. So it talks about the need for any data intermediary to register with a competent national authority. In the UK, that would be the Information Commissioner's Office, and for that authority to play a role in intervening to take action where it can see things going wrong with an intermediary. It also begins to set some standards around the things we've talked about in terms of transparency of access, pricing, and how to ensure that those different intermediaries don't discriminate against different types of users. So that really then points to governments taking a role to intervene where there might be different sorts of market failure in the development of data trusts and the need for a regulatory response.
I think there's also potential, building on what Jess says, for it to solve some tricky problems for government. One that's come up so I serve on the Office for Life Sciences Data Innovation Board, and they're constantly trying to, in the UK with the Nationalised Health Service, there's quite a large body of data that should be very useful for various purposes, but it's also probably the data that renders us most vulnerable. They very often spent time working to work out what sensible consent terms should be in order to use this data en masse. And the thing I keep trying to encourage them to do was say, well, spend the best time you can working out what that should look like, and then construct a trust to place that data in and get the right data trustees in place, work out a way of funding that trust for a certain limited period of time, and then importantly, invite and support other bodies to create alternative trusts at the outset. So for example, we have various privacy groups where people can move their data into those trusts from day one. And I think that this type of approach is kind of important because the governments are stuck in this situation of having a one-size-fits-all policy, which is what makes it so difficult for them to legislate. But this would avoid that challenge because I would hope that things like medical confidential would then, they would just put their money where their mouth is. They would form the relevant trust. They would make it available to people. And they would say, look, if you join medical confidential, we're just not going to share your data. And then people will, that you need a program, you need all sorts of public programs of the type we probably have given up doing since the 1950s and 60s to sort of explain to people what's going on. But I think that other type of interaction of the governments seeding the trusts could help kickstart the ecosystem. But you can imagine that a large country like the UK is perhaps reluctant to sort of dive into that without sort of a better sense of how it's all going to work.
Okay, Sandra, did you want to ask your question? Do you have a mic where you're at?
Yeah, I think that, my question is how people would know what's up. You can see the text. My question is how people would know which data trust holds which data, how to communicate with it, how to access it. And it is, as Whit comments, it's hard to see how that would happen without some form of centralization. So I'm just wondering if anyone else has any additional thoughts on that.
Perhaps to pitch in there, we've seen different attempts at this from some of our current data intermediaries who are very much focused on the kind of user experience that the people engaging with their platforms are having and how they can present in an accessible way what data or what information is being used for what purpose. So I think there are lessons there from kind of human computer interaction fields and user design and user experience. But it's definitely a challenge, especially when we're thinking about these really complex flows of data that might be going through different organizations or data rights that might be being exercised in different ways.
Peter, you also had a couple of questions. Do you have a microphone where you are?
I do indeed. Yes. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so there's a couple of questions, and I suppose the cynic in me, and especially when surrounded by lawyers, I get very nervous because things tend to get very complicated, and in terms that the average person like myself find very hard to navigate. And so, how do we make sure that we don't? And especially with Ostrom, as Neil's put in there, was very much based on representation through multiple methods. If the interest in, and I assume we're talking about individual data now, because my interest is actually more commons data sets as opposed to individual, but let's stick with individual. How do we ensure that trustees don't get captured by the environment around them and don't become so complex and wound in abstract law that the whole purpose and meaning of the trust is lost in the ether somewhere? How do we ensure a real understanding and we don't end up with 58 pages of, click, I agree, and I have absolutely no idea what I've just agreed to? How do we not just default into another version of that, given that the money involved is so enormous?
I think it's a great question. I'm really grateful you raised this, Peter, because this has to be talked about. So you're completely right that in the absence of any, let's call them institutional safeguards again, but I'm going to unpack this. In the absence of that, you would be right to say, well, each trust can just set terms that are increasingly complicated to the extent that it just reproduces the problem that we currently have, right? So absolutely. And then the answers come in layers. So the first kind of layer is to say, well, that's part of the point for going for trust law rather than contractual structures like co-op. Is what's interesting is that in equity or in trust law, you have a court overseeing each trust, which is much freer to interpret the terms of the trust in a way that puts forward or that prioritizes what they call good faith or moral standards over a very literal interpretation of the terms of each trust. So there's a different standard of interpretation that applies in equity law or trust law that very much goes in the direction of let's interpret this in the spirit in which it should be interpreted and not according to the letter of the agreement. So that's one point. It's a minor point, I think, but it's a point that needs to be emphasized. Then there's the second layer. The second layer is to say, well, who are the trustees and how should they be held to their fiduciary standards? So the court can hold them to their fiduciary standards, and the court can intervene, and actually the burden of proof is reversed, etc. So that goes in favor of extra protection, but that's not enough, right? And so when you acknowledge that it's not enough, you have several options. One is to say, and that, again, is an option among others, is to say, well, data trustees, if they do become the profession of the 21st century, like the much needed profession, you might find that data trustees are just like doctors and lawyers, also regulated by professional standards and a professional body that can have much more nimble type of regulation, right? And that can have teeth, yeah. So it's not all symbolic. You can be forbidden from exercising your profession, and you can be referred for prosecution, etc. And then there's a third layer, which is essential, is to say, well, even if data trustees do become a profession, and even if there are professional standards and professional bodies that can act as a kind of local layer of regulation, I think you still need an oversight body. So basically, call it a data trust oversight body, or I don't know exactly how you would call it. At the moment in the UK, we have the ICO, but the ICO is rather busy doing a lot of things. And so I think there is a call for saying, well, if we do create data trust, and we are serious about this data trust serving people and empowering people as we would like them to, then actually it's possible that we do need some kind of regulatory body that is created by legislative intervention. So these are different layers in solutions to a problem, but I like to think of them as layers. So I don't think on its own, any solution can work. So you need a mix of solutions. And I think together you get something fairly robust. Once you think of equity with different types of interpretation standards, professional standards, and then an oversight body with, well, basically a regulatory body, then you start having the kind of framework that can answer your concerns. But there are important concerns. Nobody's going to deny that.
And I think it highlights the importance of the training of the data trustees.
Yes,
Because
which,
which is, and there's this real problem is this need for a co-evolution of, we can't have data trusts without data trustees. So, you know, we're gonna, how that's managed, I think, is fascinating.
This is something Neil and I often end up talking about, is the chicken and egg question. How do you create data trust if you don't have data trustees? Because I'm quite passionate to say, you know, law schools are sleeping. I mean, we are not training the people we need. We are not training people with the kind of skills that can take on these kinds of jobs, which are crucially needed. So I would sing in front of millions of people if you want, in order to get law schools to work with computer science schools, etc., to train people with the right kind of skills. But anyway, that's a different.
It was
chapter.
great to hear John being passionate about the sort of the trusts, but one experience I have is a lot of lawyers never even think about that form of law, and as soon as you bring it up, they basically, their instinct is to tell you you don't want it, that it's too complicated, and please deal with the contract, which is something that they know how to do. And it's when you have these conversations amongst lawyers that haven't thought about this and looked at it, this is almost the first debate you have to have. So the current sort of broad generalizing to a large extent, obviously probably insulting some people on the call, the broad spectrum of lawyers are not the right people. They may be exactly the right people, Peter, to do exactly what you described. And I think that's a big concern.
Well, and thanks, Sylvie, and sorry, John, to jump in here. And I appreciate that. I think my concern still lies with the idea that there is a professional body needed. And for example, there's a school of thought that says actually in the US, we don't have enough lawyers, in that I should be able to go to a local bank and have a person in the bank do 90% of the type of legal work that I need done, and that the ABA and the whole bar itself is an artificial means to limit the number of lawyers and create an environment that one needs to go to the holy mount to sort of engage. And if we're talking about a world where there's power in decentralization and everyone's voice, and how do we ensure we don't lose that and just simply create yet another guild?
I think that's a really great point, because professions are used as monopolies as much as they're used as, and one could also argue the same thing about doctors. One could really mess this up, I think, is the answer, Peter.
If I could give you some hope, I'd like to try. Most of my students who've gone on to law school were well technically trained. Sorry, but having an undergraduate in a technical discipline and then going on to a graduate level school allows for something in this country that many other nations have yet to recognize the value in, and maybe it's public financing of education that is the trap for that. But I am amazed at how many of my former students have huge technical skills. So I believe that the chicken and egg problem is one that may well exist in some nations, but I think over here it's not as big a barrier. But Peter, was it you said that how do you get, and Neil, you said it, how do you get lawyers to wrap their head around this new idea that you came up with, and then they're not just ready to jump on? And here, JWBs is ready. But again, maybe tens of thousands of lawyers who've been produced in the last 2 decades are capable of doing this, and they're being real well paid at big firms and at big corporations. You're going to need to attract them, and you're not going to attract them with, don't worry, you'll be paid by the state. I mean, maybe you can, but initially some cloud operator is going to be the main custodian, and the trustee is going to do governance matters and maybe make up contracts or try to come up with form contracts that will lower the transaction costs from click wraps, et cetera. Okay, I'm winding down, Ms.
Okay,
House.
there's a bunch of good questions here. One, I know we're running out of time. There's one that I'd like to have asked because I have a follow-up question to it. Let's see, it's from Joa. Do you have?
Joa, hi.
Hi. Can you ask your question? Because I do have a follow-up to it. I think it's important.
Yeah, as I said, it might be a silly sort of very lawyerly question given what everybody's been saying maybe, but I guess existing trust law in the US in any case requires a very defined property or res to be held in trust. And sure, that doesn't necessarily have to be something tangible or even just money, but it has to be one of the acknowledged types of property law. And so given that data is not yet treated as property in the US, what rights would be held in trust, and would those be sufficiently defined for a judge to accept it as an actual trust using existing law?
So that's a great question, Joao. And this debate is live. So so in Europe, there's quite a growing literature actually that discusses whether you could consider the rights granted by the GDPR, for instance, as property rights, because they say, right to access, erasure, etc. At the end of the day, you could treat them as property rights because they give you positive powers, etc. And this debate is fascinating, but luckily, it does the feasibility of data trust doesn't hinge on whether or not you can define data as an asset that lends itself to property rights. Why? Because, and this is really interesting, talking to trust lawyers, there's actually unanimous agreement that it's a mistake to think of the subject matter of the trust as property. Subject matter of the trust is rights. And so as soon as you have rights, you can put them in the trust. Now, of course, you need to have almost any rights can be put in trust, but they need to be positive rights. And so you can't, for instance, put in trust a negative right, that wouldn't work. And you can't put in trust, say, your right to vote, because there's obvious public policy reasons why you don't want to put that in a trust. But other than that, then really it's a case of saying, okay, in the US, you don't have the GDPR, but do you have rights over your data? And the answer you need to give it to me is, I'm sure you don't have many rights, but maybe you have contractual rights in some cases, I don't know. And maybe you have some IP rights, if that. So I think you're right to say that in most of the US, there's a very fair question. In California, you do have rights, luckily. So in California, you could create a data trust. But in the rest of the US, I think the point is moot. I wouldn't try right now to try and set up a data trust in outside California, because I wouldn't be sure that you have the kind of rights that can be put in trust. So it's an important question. And I would like to be taught, actually, because please tell me what your view on this is.
Well, just to follow up real quick, in the US, we kind of have this division between what we call raw data and derived data. And I think that brings in some complexity into what the trust is actually governing, because with raw data, so you collect raw data, but if you're allowing other actors to analyze this data and create conclusions or predictions based on the data, that's creating a whole new set. So does that set that's created outside of the trust by a third party still belong to the trust?
That's you can see that then can be negotiated by the trust. I mean, in that sense, in the UK, if it's personal data, the raw data has personal data rights associated with it. And then, of course, once it's been processed, then intellectual property rights tend to come into play in some form or another. But if the trust, and I would say sort of to counter the one argument you could have for setting up a data trust in an area where there aren't existing personal data rights, it's just another argument Sylvie makes is that you could, once you've got enough data within a trust, then you could force those rights to exist through a contractual relationship. So you could negotiate with the group that's interested in the data that you will stipulate that or we will write a contract that in effect ensures certain things which could look equivalent to rights within the data trust. Of course, that's quite a lot more work. And then you would have to negotiate those contracts each time. But I think the point you're making, Kimberly, is absolutely critical. And one of the first questions that I think we all think that people need to ask when they're looking at data trusts, is what rights does the data give rise to? Are they intellectual property rights? Are they personal data rights? Because these are very different things. And one of the things we're seeing is a lot of activity around data trusts where the data trust is designed to hold probably intellectual property rights to the data. But you can sort of see all sorts of interesting things even with data privacy laws. So with GDPR, you have a situation where if we were to collect, someone was to collect our data through our mobile phones and then anonymize it, we lose all right to that data. So that becomes purely intellectual property rights. But this fascinates me because in the pandemic, we've had a situation where mobile phone companies have not been willing to freely share mobility data that would have been extremely useful for dealing with the pandemic. Mobility data that originates from people, but because it's de-anonymized to a great extent, I mean, you can't pick out, if it's just movement between cell towers, then it's become entirely owned by them. And I find that a funny concept. I mean, I think that there's a sense in which you could imagine, and this would be a sort of counterexample to what Sylvie's saying, you could imagine a data trust or governments or whoever putting in legislation that sort of says there are situations under which you need to make this data available for the public good because it's data pertaining to our citizens. And even though you have anonymized it and therefore it seems to be subject only to intellectual property rights, we would like that access back to it. But again, that's another sort of direction you could go in.
Okay, we have a question from the audience if you want to unmute real quick.
Hi, my name is Aditya and I'm a PhD candidate at the Center for Techno-Moral Features at the University of Edinburgh. This presentation paper have been really useful because my project is on community-led governance frameworks for data. I had a question about, and I think you sort of addressed it now, but yeah, the idea of could you generalize these models to non-personal data? And I think you've addressed it in terms of, yeah, what matters is the right to that there's a right, whether it be data protection or intellectual property, but I'd like to hear more from you on it.
So just to say something, I was fascinated because when John was explaining what the original antitrust legislation was, and I hadn't sort of fully realized, it was the first time, oh, it's because state legislation prevented people owning companies across state lines. So people put those companies into trusts to manage that. So yes, absolutely, you could imagine that type of thing happening, but you can also imagine some quite serious dangers with it. And I think I'm not entirely familiar with what the intention was with Sidewalk Labs, but it looked to me to be something that was going in that direction, using trust law, I mean, without even thinking about it that much, to sort of to try and get rid of responsibilities around data. And I think that that could definitely come up when it's IP rights that are being put into trust. And it is, I mean, I start, you could use these same mechanisms in pretty dangerous ways. And I sometimes worry that if it's IP rights that are being placed in, that's one of the things that could result, but you can imagine good cases for that as well. But I'm not the expert. Sylvie would be.
Well, I think in general, it's worth emphasizing that data trusts are not meant as a universal solution to all problems, right? So actually, I think when it comes to IP rights, for instance, so who holds IP rights? Well, most of the time, they're organizations or companies. I mean, sometimes individuals have IP rights, but it would be very, I mean, we're talking of exceptions. So most of the time, I think if you talk of organizations wanting to share data, so let's talk of anonymized data over which they have IP rights, I don't think data trust is a particularly well-suited mechanism. I think if you want to responsibly share anonymized data over which you have IP rights, you could go through contractual arrangements. I think the whole idea of trust law is really coming from an acknowledgement of the vulnerabilities that come from personal data. And so in a way, it's I think it's over-engineering or putting a PR layer on something. So I know that there's a trust, like the Truata trust is actually a case of horizontal data sharing, basically between organizations of supposedly, anonymized data over which they have IP rights. Now, it sounds great to say, oh, we've created a data trust, but did they need a data trust? I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. And so I think it's important to distinguish between organizations wanting to share data, anonymized data. You can do that through contract. And then you have the other question, which is, what do you do with data over which there is no right, right? So when we go and study the bottom of the oceans, or I don't know, the movement of birds in my neighborhood, well, that's the case for data commons. Yeah, you don't want to create data trust everywhere. There are very, very important structures like data commons that should not be replaced by data trust because they serve different aims, basically.
And there's another one that keeps popping up, which is a tricky one, is national infrastructure. Data about national infrastructure that would be useful for many people, but then actually, if you make it freely available, creates security issues. So if you reveal to everyone exactly how your electrical grid is wired up, you reveal great vulnerabilities to attack. And that one's an interesting one because that keeps popping up. It's not data that's even if it is it's not about the rights you're worrying about, it's about some sort of national security issue around the data. I mean, there's other interesting data sets like movement of vulnerable people. So people are interested, and it's come up several times, I think, hasn't it, Jess, Sylvie, like the idea we want to create a data trust to deal with vulnerable refugees. And it's sort of like, okay, not sure how this works. You know, it's not a global fix it for the fact that there's vulnerable people and that there's rights here. Like perhaps what you want to create is very secure ways of looking after data that mean it can't be attacked, but whether that needs to be a trust is another question.
Okay, we've run a bit over, so we're kind of losing people. I just want to thank our panelists so much. I think this was a great first panel because it really starts to give us the issues that we want to think about. Just one real quick thing that Neil brought up was, are you familiar with the Google Sidewalk Labs in Toronto, that whole debacle? Basically, there was concerns of the people who lived there over the surveillance aspect of what they wanted to do. So they pulled out because basically Google wanted to use that information for, or this is my impression, they wanted access to that information. They would not agree to the limits that the municipality was trying to set on it. So I think that's kind of goes to what you're saying is when we're looking at all these different kinds of interests, it is going to take some convincing to get these large tech companies to buy into this kind of concept. But I think it's very, very worthwhile because of the benefits that it can achieve, but especially in the US where we simply don't have the protections that people do elsewhere in the world. So I really want to thank Sylvie, Neil, and Jess for their participation. And I wish we could have gotten to all these great questions because I think
Kimberly, I've noticed for some reason I can't save the questions or copy them or anything. Can we switch, since we're recording, like the questions seem to be like a really useful resource and I was wanting to save them.
Okay.
Can we switch that on before we shut things down? Because I know with Zoom that data will be lost.
Okay.
Okay, you've got them, Angie. Yeah, okay. It's just I can't get them.
Perhaps someone can send them out as an email if they can capture them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not. Maybe Angie has the technical capacity there.
The great thing is, I could just want to state, computer scientists aren't any better at this. You know, you might think that when you have these meetings, that this is all no.
Well, thank you.
But yeah. Please don't switch it all off till you've managed to save the question. Right. Brilliant.
Okay. All
Thank you
right.
very much, Kimberly and Angie, for putting it together and
Yes.
for the invites. It was really a great privilege to present at the Ostrom workshop.
Yeah, this was enormously valuable. I so appreciate you. Yeah.
Yeah,
And thank you, everybody. I wish we could keep talking. So please don't hesitate to get in touch if we haven't had
John,
a chance.
particularly with your, I think that your passion for the trusts approach. Yes, yes.
John is passionate about everything.
Yeah, I